All right, we're about to dive into a medical mystery that basically flips one of the biggest rules of health completely upside down. It's a paradox that really challenges everything we think we know about body weight and survival.
You know this equation, right? It's been drilled into us for decades. Obesity leads to bad health outcomes. And look, for the most part, that is absolutely true. But what if I told you that for people who are already sick, this arrow doesn't always point the way you think it does? Okay, so let's get into it. Before we can even touch the paradox, we have to start with the baseline reality, the undisputed science that clearly shows obesity is a major cause of a lot of chronic diseases.
As a risk factor, being obese absolutely jacks up your chances of developing really serious conditions. We're talking heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, stroke. It's all tied to things like chronic inflammation and a huge extra workload on your heart. This part isn't up for debate. It's solid medical consensus.
But this is where things get really weird. Once someone actually develops one of those chronic illnesses, something baffling starts to show up in the clinical data. And that something is what researchers call the obesity paradox.
So, what is it exactly? Well, the obesity paradox is this totally counterintuitive finding. For people who are already diagnosed with certain chronic conditions, having a higher BMI, being overweight or even mildly obese, is actually linked to living longer.
Just let that sink in for a second. The very thing that probably helped cause the illness in the first place could, paradoxically, become a key to surviving it. That one sentence is the entire puzzle we're trying to solve here. And this isn't just some random fluke, you know? It's been seen over and over again in several major chronic diseases. We see it in patients with congestive heart failure, with chronic kidney disease, COPD, and even some cancers, and in elderly patients. In pretty much all these cases, it's often the underweight patients who have the worst prognosis. So the big question is, why? How is this even possible? Well, scientists have come up with several really powerful reasons that help explain what's going on. Let's unpack the mechanisms behind this whole medical mystery.
We can break the explanation down into 4 key parts, what I'm calling the energy bank, the muscle shield, the hidden helpers, and finally, the measurement problem. Put them all together, and they pretty much solve the mystery.
First up, the energy bank. Think about it. Chronic diseases are incredibly taxing on the body. They put it into this catabolic state, where it's basically breaking itself down for fuel. A person with more fat and glycogen stores simply has a bigger energy bank to pull from. That buffer can be the difference maker, delaying severe muscle wasting, which is a major killer in these illnesses. Next, we have the muscle shield. And this is so important. It isn't just about fat. People who carry more weight often have more absolute muscle mass too. And when you're chronically ill, losing muscle is a much bigger predictor of mortality than losing fat. So if you start with more muscle to spare, well, that's a huge protective advantage. Third, there are the hidden helpers. It turns out that fat tissue isn't just sitting there. It's an active organ that makes hormones. And in the middle of a chronic illness, some of the stuff it produces can actually help fight off harmful inflammation. For instance, in heart failure patients, a higher body mass can actually lead to more stable blood pressure, which helps them handle the essential medications they need to survive.
And finally, we've got the measurement problem. A lot of this comes down to BMI, that simple height-to-weight ratio we always use. But it's famously flawed, right? It can't tell the difference between fat and muscle. So a patient with a normal BMI might actually be really frail with very little muscle. Their low weight might just be a symptom of how sick they are, not a sign of health. At the same time, overweight patients often get diagnosed earlier and treated more aggressively, which, well, that can also improve their outcomes.
Okay, now before we go any further, I have to make a really, really important clarification. This is probably the single most important point of this whole explainer, because misunderstanding this part could be genuinely dangerous.
The survival advantage we see in the obesity paradox? It's seen almost exclusively in people who fall into the overweight and mildly obese categories. We're talking a BMI between about 25 and 35.
And to be perfectly clear, this paradox has a hard limit. It absolutely does not apply to severe or morbid obesity. Once a person's BMI gets over 35, the negative health effects just completely overwhelm any potential protective benefit. At that point, obesity is still a massive mortality risk, full stop.
So with all of that in mind, what does this new understanding really look like? How do we square these two ideas that seem to be fighting each other?
The key takeaway is really this.
The rules of the game change completely once a chronic illness is in the picture. At that point, survival becomes less about the risk factors that cause the disease and way more about your body's metabolic reserve, its ability to just withstand the long, brutal stress of being sick.
And that brings us to this final two-sided view of obesity. It's harmful because it seriously raises your chances of getting sick. But once that sickness is there, having those extra energy and muscle reserves can, strangely enough, become a protective shield that helps you survive longer.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. The obesity paradox forces us to be so much more nuanced in how we think about health and weight. It shows us that what's healthy isn't just one fixed number on a scale, but a dynamic thing that can change dramatically when the body is under the extreme stress of a chronic illness.